Thank you very much. So this evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about two subjects. Firstly, the selection of an exhibit title, and related to that, the creation of a title page. Now, this presentation is based on one which I made a few days ago for the Abraham Accords Philatelic exhibition, which was the first joint exhibition between the State of Israel and the United Arab Emirates. The exhibition was based on the accords signed August the previous year, which normalized relations between the two countries. And in recognition of the US involvement and encouragement of that accord, the US also participated in that exhibition. So it was a three-way exhibition between the State of Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States. The organizers of the show made the mistake of asking me to chair the jury. And one of the aspects which the jury felt many of the exhibitors needed to address was this issue of the choice of the title of their exhibit and also the creation of the title page. So next. Now, why is the title important? It seems really such a minor detail in relation to all the work and all the time that we all put into preparing our exhibits. Well, really, there are four basic reasons why the title is really very important. The first is that it actually alerts the judge as to exactly what will be shown in the exhibit. The second aspect, which is a little more indirect, is that it actually creates an impression of the exhibit in the judge's mind. When the judges read the title, it's only human nature, they are going to reach certain decisions and make certain assumptions about the exhibit. The other aspects are that depending on the choice of title, the title will let the judges know whether the exhibit is going to be a broadly based one covering a long extended period of time, or a narrower exhibit focusing on one or two issues or one or two aspects of postal history, but in much greater depth. And probably the most important reason why the title is important is that you want to encourage the judge to look more carefully at the exhibit and with greater interest. If the judge looks at the title and kind of dismisses the exhibit, you've immediately put yourself at a disadvantage. You want to encourage the judge and make him say, I really want to spend some time looking at this exhibit and to understand it. Next. Now, obviously, you're all, as experienced exhibitors and collectors, familiar with the whole idea of the exhibit classes. And basically, what I'm going to talk about primarily focuses on postal history, traditional postal stationery, and the, should we call them, the more long-established categories. I'm not really going to talk specifically about thematics or social display class, nor about the new postcard class, or indeed banknotes, which have started to appear in some of the stamp exhibitions around the world. But one of the points that I would like to make is that more often than not, many of the problems with exhibit title come with the postal history exhibits. In that class, there are generally more issues with the choice of title than in any of the other classes that we look at. Next. Now, obviously, these exhibit titles, which are shown here, were predominantly oriented towards that Abraham Accords exhibition between the US, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. But each of those titles makes a fundamental and really important message to us all. All of these titles are really very vague, very broad, and really give very little sense as to the scope and content of the exhibits. I mean, for example, if you look at United States Across the Continent, a title used by George Kramer, really you don't necessarily have any idea what that exhibit might include. Generalized subjects like Aden postal history, no sense of time period, no sense of scope. Southern Mail, unless you realize that this was an exhibit of Confederate States, or now as they call it, American Civil War, you would have no idea what the content of the exhibit was. Crash and interrupted flight covers, again, a very, very broad, unspecific title. Mesopotamia to Iraq, the same thing. The only thing it defines is some geographical scope, but nothing about the period of time covered or the nature of the postal history that's going to be shown. And that's really a common theme with each of these titles. They really convey very, very little information to the judges or indeed to the public looking at the exhibits. Next. Now, if we look at some of the other categories and some of the exhibit titles from those other categories, we have basically the same problem. Egyptian postal stationery, no sense of the time period, no sense as to whether it covers all types of postal stationery or just selected ones. Mozambique and Mozambique Company, again, no idea of the scope. The artist sketches of Israel, at least we have some definition that is going to be proof and archival material, but again, no idea of the time period. An exhibit title closer to home, which I think came from the New York 2016 exhibition, Essays and Proofs of the Stamps of Mexico. Again, no idea whether this is 19th century issues, 20th century issues, all types of postal issues, or there's no detail. Perhaps one of the worst of all is Classic Germany. Looking at this title in isolation, you have absolutely no idea of the scope of that exhibit. First Stamps of Europe is a close second. No idea. It conveys no information about the scope and content. Now, the thing I'd like to emphasize about this slide and the previous slide, these are real titles of real exhibits shown at international exhibitions. These are not just titles that I made up to convey a point. These are titles chosen by the exhibitors themselves and used at recent exhibitions. Next. Now, apart from titles that really convey very little information, you also have ambiguous titles which can be misunderstood or misinterpreted. And this is just one example. Taking the United Nations administration in Indonesia, the UNTEA authority. The first title talks of uses of the UNTEA overprinted stamps. Now, in this case, you would expect that covers and other postal documents would only be stamps overprinted UNTEA. That's what you would expect from the title. Now, that same exhibit has also been presented under the title of Postal History of UNTEA. Same exhibit, change of title. But in that second title, you would expect to see a somewhat different range of material than shown in that first exhibit. So not only is it necessary to be careful how you describe your exhibit, but you also need to avoid any possibility of having a title that could be misunderstood. And next. Now, summarizing, what have these last few slides really said to all of us? In all cases, the scope, the content, and the details of the exhibit are very unclear. And as a result, the judges do not know what to expect. And it is very, very hard for them to prepare for the judging process, assuming that they actually do any preparation. Next. Now, let's try and define what might be helpful for judges in terms of an exhibit title. What I would suggest is that there are really three components which would be helpful for a clear title. Clear could be considered as a good title. I use the term clear because there isn't necessarily one single answer to what the title should be. But the three aspects which I think are important. Firstly, you have to define the geographical scope of the exhibit. What countries, what areas are involved? Secondly, you have to clarify the time period covered by the exhibit. What years are involved? And thirdly, it is helpful to at least give some indication of the philatelic characteristics of the exhibit. What type of exhibit is it that the judges and the public will be looking at? So, in summary, a clear title gives the judge a sense of what the exhibit is about, where it exists in geographic space and time, and most importantly, the title should be directly related to the scope of the exhibit. Next. Now, let's talk a little bit more about geographical scope. And again, I apologize that the examples in the slide are somewhat oriented, again, to perhaps mission, but really the same basic ideas apply. So in terms of geographical scope, the geographical scope could be a country, a political or national entity. So for example, the Indian Postal Administration in the Arabian Gulf. This happened in a clearly defined period of time. The United Arab Emirates was formed in the early 1970s. Prior to that, each of the emirates was separately administered and had a separate postal arrangement. Obviously, the British Mandate of Palestine started at the end of the First World War. Again, it clearly defines the scope. State of Israel similarly. United States Postmaster Provisionals. This immediately tells you that these are not the general issues issued by the US Post Office, but were the local provisionals issued by individual postmasters in, for example, St. Louis or New York, prior to the introduction of the US general issues, as shown in the next title. Now, other things can basically be, again, political entities. For example, the US administration of the Ryukyu Islands after the Second World War. Finally, an example, the United Nations offices in New York. They, since the beginning, have issued their own stamps. It clearly defines the geographical scope. It differentiates the offices in New York from those in Geneva and Vienna, which also issued their own stamps. Next. Now, if we turn next to the time period covered by the exhibit, ideally, you should include a specific start and end date for the exhibits. Now, importantly, these dates should not just be the date of the earliest or the latest item shown. The time period covered should have direct relevance to the subject shown. For example, if you take the UN administration, from the foundation of the UN Postal Service, from the establishment of the American administration in the Ryukyus, It shouldn't just be the earliest item shown. Now, also, when you define the beginning and the end period based on the geographical entity that you're showing, obviously the items that you show should be as close as possible to those start dates. If you're going to start an exhibit with the US general issues, for example, the 5 and 10 cent that were first issued in 1847, you obviously should try and show an issue as close to 1847 as possible. If all your covers come from 1849, 1850, then you have a problem with the time period of your exhibit. And that I just use as one example. Now, next, putting this again in concrete terms, again, unfortunately related more to the Abraham Accord show, you should look at the start dates for the different time periods of administration, the end periods similarly. Taking two examples, the Arabian Gulf countries, what now Kuwait, Qatar, Dubai, they had a period of Indian postal administration initially. This was followed by a very short period of Pakistan postal administration. The postal administration was then transferred to the British, and then finally to an independent postal administration. Now, for each of those periods, you could make an exhibit, or you could make an exhibit that comprises all of those time periods. But again, you should carefully define in your title which of those periods you're actually addressing and which of them are going to be examined in detail. If we turn it into Palestine, obviously you started with a period of Ottoman administration. You had a series of foreign post offices, the Russian, the German, the French. After the First World War, we had the British Mandate under the League of Nations. And then finally, after the Second World War, we had the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, if you're producing an exhibit related to the stamps or postal history of Palestine, you need to clearly define with dates which of those periods specifically you're addressing, whether it's one, two, or all. Next. Now, some specific titles which make clear both the geographical scope and the time periods would be those shown on the slide currently. So, for example, the Great Britain stamp issues overprinted Kuwait, 1948 to 1958, the period of the British administration. You've defined clearly that it's Great Britain stamps, overprinted. You've defined the geographical scope being Kuwait, and you've defined the time period, that of the British administration. The next title, the 1961 Trucial States definitive issue, actually comprises only one series of stamps, which was issued in 1961. The issue was almost entirely used only in the Trucial State of Dubai, and as such lends itself only really to a one-frame exhibit. But again, from the title, it's very clear what the scope of that exhibit is. If we look at the Palestine Blues, again, this is basically two stamps and their surcharges, a very narrow time period, a very narrow group of material. The pictorial issues between 1927 and 1945, on the other hand, represents a much longer time period. It represents different printings, different papers. It is a much broader scope and is obviously only appropriate for a multi-frame exhibit. The next title, the Dorivery issue, is one series of stamps for the State of Israel, a single series of stamps. But again, from the title, it's very clear what is the scope of that exhibit. The 1869 issue of the US is also very similar, very clear, one issue of stamps from one country. Next. Now, the third aspect of the title, which I'd mentioned, were the philatelic characteristics of the exhibit. And there are really three areas that one should consider. First of all, the title should clearly indicate the class for which the exhibit has been submitted. Secondly, the title of the exhibit should be relevant to the scope of the exhibit. You don't want a title that implies a lot of postal history when it's really a traditional exhibit. You don't want to imply if there were, for example, postage due issues within the time period. You need to define whether the exhibit might or might not include those issues. And thirdly, the title of the exhibit should give some insight to the treatment used in the exhibit. Now, let's put that into some sort of concrete terms with the next slide. Now, if we take a postal history exhibit, the title should clarify if the exhibit is arranged by postal markings, postal rates and routes, the postal services, or a combination thereof. Now, if you think back to many of those postal history titles which were shown on the earlier slide, none of those titles gave any sense as to how the exhibit was to be arranged. In fact, many of those exhibits were simply arranged chronologically, that is to say, from the earliest material through year by year to the more recent material. And I would suggest that, generally speaking, a simple chronological arrangement is not a good choice for a postal history exhibit. Ideally, one should focus on some or all of these three categories: the markings, the rates and routes, or the postal services. And next. Now, in a traditional exhibit, there are very similar arguments that can be put forward. The title should clarify whether the exhibit might include forerunners, that is to say, items prior to the material comprising the primary focus of the exhibit. For example, if you were showing the stamp issues, the Victorian stamp issues of Barbados, for example, whilst the vast majority of the exhibit might be focused on those stamp issues, you might include a few pages, maybe 3 or 4 pages, or possibly half a frame in an 8-frame exhibit of pre-stamp covers, illustrating some of the postal service and some of the postal markings prior to the introduction of stamps. The title also should give a sense whether the exhibit will include pre-production, proof, or archival material. Will it include proofs from, if it's a country that used Waterloo and Sons, will there be material from the Waterloo archives? If it's a country that used the American Banknote Company, will there be archival material from the American Banknote archives? Are we going to expect to see errors, varieties, and misprints? And more importantly, are we going to see uses of those stamps? Or is the exhibit one that is confined only to the production of the stamps and the issued stamps themselves? In a perfect world, the title and treatment should explain some of this scope and content for the exhibit. Next. Now, again, kind of repeating myself, which my wife tells me I do frequently, let's look at some titles for postal history exhibits which actually do a good job of defining the scope and content of the exhibits. And illustrated are 6 examples which define both scope, period, and content. And these 6 are for postal history exhibits. For most of you, perhaps one of the good examples is the Columbia title, which clearly defines that it is pre-philatelic, as prior to the stamps, and it's focused on postal services and routes. The title above it, the Swiss Postal Services Development. Again, it clearly says the emphasis is upon the services. The title above that, Victorian Outgoing Indian Mail. It clearly defines the period, confirmed by the date span. It's early Victorian, from the introduction of the first stamps in India in October of 1854, only through to the period July of 1876. And it's only addressing outgoing mail. There is no domestic mail covered in that exhibit. The last of the titles, the Muscat, again, clearly defines the country, Muscat, the time period, 1864 to 1948, and it clearly clarifies the administrative period addressed by the exhibit. That is to say, the Indian Post Office. If you think back to what I said earlier about the Indian Post Office, the Pakistan Post Office, the British Post Office, and then the independent postal administrations, this clearly defines the time period and the scope of the exhibit. Next. The next slide shows just 4 titles for traditional exhibits, which again try to very clearly define the scope and content of the exhibits. The first 2 start out with a very clear definition of a country. They then define, in the first case, the stamp issues that will be covered, the description of the stamp issues that the exhibit comprises, and the title ends with a clearly defined time period. The second exhibit, again starting out with the country, addresses next the date span, and finally the political entities that will be included. That is to say, the occupational issues first of Baghdad, which were localized for use in Baghdad, and the general occupational issues, which were inscribed Iraq and which were used throughout the country. The one ambiguity title is not a direct question whether the local Basra will also be shown. One would assume that they will not be shown. Now again, the third title defines the country, the US. It defines that it is addressing only the imperfect issues, but not the first issue, not the first imperfect issue of 1847, but rather the series of stamps, the 1, the 3, the 5, the 10, and the 12, issued between 1851 and 1856. And then it addresses how the postal system expanded within that time period. So it addresses the question of which stamp issues are included, and it also explains clearly that you will have a strong emphasis on how those stamps were used within the expanding postal system of that time period. Now, the last title, although it does not include any reference to date, by defining the large Hermes heads of Greece, Paris printings, you very clearly define the scope of that exhibit, that it comprises only the large Hermes heads and the Paris printings. In a sense, as we'd say in English, the date is mute. It is implied by the descriptor of the philatelic material included in the exhibit. Now, next. Now, the next slide is probably one of the most important for all of you. And this is focused on your exhibit title. So rather than talking about other people's titles, this is really focused very much on the title that you yourself might choose to use. The first and really most important point is that there is not necessarily any single correct title for any exhibit. The exhibit title could be expressed in several different ways, and they could be equally correct, equally appropriate. The key thing, and again, I emphasize this point, and I emphasize it repeatedly, the title is key to understanding the exhibit. The title is the key that unlocks the exhibit for the judges and also for the public. Now, I mentioned the UNTEA exhibit earlier and how the exhibitor had changed his title. It's important to emphasize that refinement and changes to the title over time are acceptable. Many exhibits, especially at FIP exhibitions, are shown under a changed title. It's helpful, obviously, if on your application form, you make clear that this is an exhibit that was shown under a prior title. Now, why might you want to change the title over time? Well, different juries might give you suggestions as to how that title could be amended to make it more helpful for future juries. Secondly, you might actually change the scope of your exhibit. You might decide that, for example, when you added more material to the first issue of a country, that you might want to leave out the third or fourth issue. You might want to narrow the time period of your exhibit. And that's okay. Obviously, over time, you accumulate, you acquire more material. And so the scope and content of your exhibit might change. So it is absolutely okay to adjust your title, but do share that where you can on the application form. Now, this is maybe just a personal thing. Some exhibitors try to choose a humorous title, or as we say in English, a kitschy title for their exhibit. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Generally speaking, especially where you're dealing with a jury from different countries whose first language may not be your first language, if you choose a humorous title, it may work in your language, but it may not work to them. And so generally speaking, I would try wherever you can to avoid some sort of humorous or kitschy title. Now, again, to repeat a point, it's really important that the title should emphasize what the exhibit includes and what it excludes. And this comes back to that same basic point of defining the scope and content of the exhibit. So for your exhibit, it's really, really important to emphasize what is included and what is excluded. Next. Now, one of the topics which came up in the presentation for the AAPE exhibition was the use of language for an exhibit title. And Aldo Samame was on that presentation. And he and I had a kind of an open discussion about the use of language on titles. And if I quote him correctly, if I misquote him, I apologize. But generally speaking, Aldo felt that for international exhibitions, more often than not, it was best to express the title of the exhibit in English rather than a different language, whether it be French, German, Spanish, one of the official FIP languages. The reason for having the title in English was to really have the broadest possible exposure to the jury. If your jury is an international one, probably the one common language which they all have is English. It's unfortunately just a reality. And so choosing your title in English is probably a good choice. The fortunate thing is that English does allow you a little flexibility in how you express the title. And this slide just gives a couple of examples where you can use, in a sense, a title and a subtitle. The first one breaks the title, the Muscat exhibit breaks the title by the use of the colon after the date. The first part defines the broad scope, and the portion after the colon defines the kind of subscope of the exhibit. The second one, by splitting the title over 2 lines, you start out by emphasizing that the exhibit covers the Turkish post in the Holy Land between 1841 and 1918, that is the period of the Ottoman administration, and up to the end of the First World War. But the second line clearly defines the treatment of that exhibit, that the material within the exhibit is to be shown organized around routes, rates, and postmarks. Ironically, that second exhibit, actually the entire first 6 frames was arranged chronologically. So that was an example where an exhibitor did not actually follow the title that they had defined. They actually covered the Turkish post. The first 6 frames were arranged chronologically, and the final 2 frames, the first one was on the Jewish settlements, and then the last frame was on the military side of the Ottoman post in the Holy Land. So that was a clear example of where the exhibitor created a very good, effective title, but then did not actually follow the lead that they had set for themselves in that title. Next. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wasn't really going to say much about thematic or display exhibits, and that's true. Now, are thematic and display exhibits really that different? Well, no, not really. The same basic need for clarity in the title is exactly the same as for postal history and for traditional. Obviously, taking it on a simple basis, in a theme or subject or topical based exhibit, the topic replaces the geographical scope and the time period. But again, the basic principles of clarity and clear definition are required. Next. Now again, being consistent, repeating myself, beating the same drum, and emphasizing the same points. What have I said so far in the first 40 minutes or so? Well, a poor title. The title is not related or is poorly related to the content of the exhibit. It doesn't tell you anything about what you're going to see. A good title concisely and accurately describes the content and scope of the exhibit subject. That's what it's all about, the difference between a poor title and a good title. It's really that simple. Next. Now, what I've talked about thus far is nothing new. It's not some wonderful, radical new idea like we always keep hearing about in exhibiting. You know, everybody keeps trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to philatelic exhibiting. You know, there's a new paradigm, there's a new approach, there's a new blah, 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 blah. Anyway, Bill Bauer, a very prominent American judge and past president of the American Philatelic Society, back in 1989, over 30 years ago, wrote these words. And really, in 40 minutes, I could not say any better than what Bill Bauer wrote. It's there in Spanish for you all, but I will read it, the English version. I will not try to read the Spanish version. The title must accomplish several things. Set the scene for the exhibit. Define the subject to be covered. Define the scope of the exhibit, and outline the logical arrangement that will be followed. Hopefully, it comes across as clearly in Spanish as it does in English. It really says everything that can be said about the choice of a title. So that really next takes us to some of the more nitty-gritty, some of the more fine details about a title page. We've talked about what the title should actually be, what it should cover, what it should include. Well, once you've got that title, what do you do with it? Well, you have to put it on the title page. And here are a few very basic kind of reminders of things that it's easy to forget or to overlook. The title on the title page has to be large enough and in a legible font. I was actually just going over an exhibit today where the exhibitor did everything in capital letters. Every single word from beginning to end of 8 frames was all in capital letters. And I have to say it was one of the hardest exhibits to read. The font, the use of capitals, all of these basic things affect the readability of an exhibit. And the title on the title page is no different. You want to make it large enough, but legible enough. Ideally, an 18 or 20 point, and bold is helpful. Some exhibitors feel that they need to repeat the title of the exhibit on each and every page of their exhibit. No, do not repeat the title on each and every page of the exhibit. It's both time-consuming, unnecessary, it wastes space, and it just makes more words to read. The individual pages within the exhibit should include chapter headings, subheadings, or item headings only, not the title of the exhibit. Now, again, going back to something which we talked about the other day on the Abraham Accords presentation, Aldo and I, we talked about the use of bilingual or multilingual headings. Some people have done this. Is it helpful? Does it enhance the exhibit? No. I think generally, and I believe I represent what Aldo said correctly, he felt it was probably detrimental and unnecessary. Put the title in one language, and his suggestion was to use English in order to present the title firsthand to as many jurors as possible. Next. Now, apart from the title, what should the title page include? Now, this is something where a lot has been written, particularly by the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors. And if you look at almost every exhibit at any US national show, the first line of the title page after the title will start with the words, "The purpose of this exhibit is," and then it will go into some great ambition. The purpose of this exhibit. Every exhibit starts with the same words. Well, don't start with the same words, but what you do need to do is explain clearly what the exhibit is showing underneath the title. A paragraph explaining what the exhibit is showing and its coverage. In a sense, it's a repetition of the title, but with a little bit more detail and a little elaboration. I jokingly say about how every exhibit starts with the words, "The purpose of this exhibit." Well, you know, if we put our hands on our hearts, what is the purpose of the exhibit? The purpose of the exhibit is to win the grand award, of course. But that is not what the statement of purpose is about. The statement of purpose is to, again, reiterate the title and elaborate on the title. The title page also, again, and this is in a sense a further elaboration of the title, it's building upon the title. Clarify the type of exhibit. Give a clear exhibit outline or plan, a roadmap. The title is the key to the door. The exhibit outline and plan is the roadmap that allows you to follow through the exhibit, having come through the door. The title page again, and this is, one could say it's repetition, but each of these things is really, really important to get across. You want to clearly define the scope of the exhibit. You also want to explain how to interpret the presentation. How is the exhibit arranged? You know, when you show a stamp issue, are you planning to start with archival material where it exists? Or are you avoiding archival material because you don't have any? If you don't have any, you need to come up with a clear justification of why that is not being included. The other thought, and this is something that many exhibitors do, they go into long background narratives about the historical background of the country or some aspect of the administration of the subject that they're showing. And it's all background. And it's really easy to give long paragraphs that really, I don't say they're irrelevant, but they're not helpful, nor are they particularly important. Just because you found the information in Wikipedia or in Google doesn't mean to say you need to reuse it on your title page. If you want to give some historical background, keep it short, keep it relevant, and keep it focused to the subject that you're showing. At the end of the day, this is a stamp or postal history exhibit. It's not a historical discourse. So make your background narrative short and focused. Next. Now, again, all of you are familiar with the point scores and how the judges evaluate the exhibits, the treatment, the importance, the subject philatelic knowledge, and so on. You're all very familiar with those categories. Now, one of the things which many people have done successfully, next, is to, on their title page, in a sense, give a question and answer to those different judging categories. In a sense, they've responded to each of those categories with a brief statement justifying, at least in their own mind, why they should get a high score on those different categories. So first of all, they'll explain their choice of treatment and why they'll explain why that choice of treatment is, at least in their mind, the most logical one for the subject. The importance, they will again try to justify in the eyes or to the eyes of the judges why their exhibit is important, both from a global perspective and a regional perspective. At many shows now, the importance category, the 10 points, is split 5 and 5, 5 from a global perspective and 5 from a regional perspective. And many exhibitors will try to justify their importance on each of those categories. Next, they'll try to demonstrate their knowledge. I'm sorry, I didn't mean next. Sorry, can we go back? Thank you. They'll try to demonstrate their knowledge. They'll highlight their personal research. And then they'll address the challenge factor, why this is a particularly difficult subject that they're showing, and by inference, why they should get a high score. They'll also explain the key items of the exhibit and how they designate and how they mark those key items. Now, the last one, the presentation, well, that's just basic computer skills or handwritten skills. Make your exhibit neat and attractive. That's not really one that you have to justify. But a helpful title page for the jury will go through each of those categories and, in a sense, provide the jury with relevant information under each of those headings. Next. Now, there are some other some other questions that people always ask about title pages. Should you include a philatelic item? Well, sometimes. Should you include a map or an illustration? Well, sometimes. What else should you include? A short bibliography. Now, the emphasis is on short. There's no point making a list of 10 hardback books that you expect every judge who's going to be judging your exhibit to read. It's not going to happen. If you yourself have written some relevant articles that relate to the scope and content of your exhibit, that would be helpful. Also, choose articles or books which ought to be readily available to the judges. Some really obscure book in Russian or Chinese or Urdu is not going to be helpful to the judges. So make your bibliography kind of short and relevant. Oftentimes, a timeline can be helpful. Now, what is a timeline? Well, it's basically a series of dates where you say these are the kind of the milestone events that happened within the time period of my exhibit. Now, what about remarks which really relate more to the subsections and subchapters of your exhibit? Well, much of that information is better left off the title page and actually put closer to the material that it relates to. If you start a new section, that is the point at which your introductory remarks are most helpful and most relevant. If they're stuck back on the first title page, but they relate to a new section in frame 6, by the time the judges have got to frame 6, they've forgotten what you said about it. So make those outline and introductory remarks as close as possible to the section of the exhibit to which they relate. Obviously, you can allude to them, you can give an indication about them on the title page, but keep that information as close as possible to the material where it's relevant. Next. Now, one of the other aspects that's become more important in recent years is expertizing and highlighting the key items. If you go back 40, 50 years, really neither of these aspects was something that an exhibitor would even consider. The material was the material, it was there. If something had a certificate, well, that was great, but it wasn't something that you had to highlight. Today, it is now generally accepted that you should highlight items or indicate items that have been expertized. It's also become conventional to highlight the key items in your exhibit. Now, obviously, you have to be careful in highlighting your key items. Obviously, everything that you've included in the exhibit is important to you, but you have to swallow hard and say, what is really important to the story that I'm telling in the exhibit? Maybe something you've spent a lot of money on. It may be a key proof relating to the production of the issue. But you should have clear criteria in your mind as to what those key items are. One of the important things to emphasize is don't highlight too many items. This exhibit that I was looking at earlier today, where everything was in capital letters, that exhibitor mounted every item on a white background, then a piece of red trim, and then mounted it on a page. One could argue that he thought every item was important. I think it was just he chose the red and he liked the red. Normally, that's something somebody would only do for a few items in their exhibit to highlight those key items. The point I'm making is, do not have too many of those key items. Choose an appropriate but subtle way of emphasizing those key items. And on your title page, it is helpful to state simply and briefly This is how I'm highlighting my key items. Again, is there one perfect way to either highlight items that have been expertized or one perfect way to highlight key items? No. Provided you choose a consistent way, provided it's subtle and neat and attractive, and you explain what it is, it's fine. But please don't emphasize too many key items. It's one of the mistakes that many people will make. Next. Now, taking just 6 kind of basic concepts of a good title page. The first one may be controversial. Some of you may not agree with the first point. A good title page should address both the public visiting the exhibition and the judges. Obviously, as an exhibitor, as a competitor, your primary focus is to the jury. But don't forget, there are a few other people who come to the show and look at the exhibits. And they also would like to understand what your exhibit is about. So think about and consider the public as well as the judges. Relevance. Most of the information on the title page needs to be relevant to your exhibit. It goes back to what I said about the long historical narratives. It's interesting, it's background, but in most cases, it's not relevant. The third term, factual, that may seem irrelevant. Why does my title page have to be factual? Well, sometimes it's really easy to become over-enthusiastic and say, my exhibit includes many unique items, blah, 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 and so on. Well, you have to be clear. Whatever you claim about your exhibit has to be true. And that relates to the objectivity. Try and be realistic about your exhibit. If you want to emphasize the importance of your exhibit, do so in an objective and factual manner. If you have a synopsis page, or if you prepare a synopsis page, there you can be a little more indulgent in promoting your exhibit. The synopsis page is the more appropriate place to promote the exhibit and to, I don't say exaggerate its uniqueness, but to emphasize its strengths. The title page should be factual and objective. The other aspect is brevity. Be brief. I'm repeating about those historical narratives. Keep them short, but also keep a lot of the other information short. You don't need to describe in detail things that are going to be addressed when you deal with a specific cover in your exhibit. If you have a section on airmails, the title page does not need a whole paragraph explaining about the airmail service of the country. Take that section and stick it at the start of your airmail section. That's where it belongs. And the last part is readability. Really easy, big, long words, but most times short, simple words are far more effective. And keep in mind that although the judges will have your title page ahead of time, often they will be looking at the title page again when they start to judge. And they will read through that title page. So you want to get your message across to the jury in an easy to read form for when they start judging your exhibit. So readability is yet another important feature of a good title page. Next. Now, let's come back to your title page. So rather than talking about things in an abstract thing, let's talk about your specific title page. Do not highlight what you do not show. It's a really easy trap to fall into, to say, well, I don't have this and I don't have that and I don't show this, and well, the only known proof for this stamp is with my friend and I don't have it. Really, you don't need to emphasize what you do not show. It's why do you want to undermine your exhibit by saying all the things that you do not have? That's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. Now, on a practical level, ideally, the title page should be the first page that you prepare. Why? Because it's going to organize your thinking about your exhibit, your organizing of your exhibit. It's going to focus your mind on how you want that exhibit to evolve. But it should also be the last page that you edit. After you've read all the other pages of your exhibit, and after you've finished and you've spell checked and you've proofread and you've pasted everything down, you then should go back to your title page and read it and edit it and make sure that it is still relevant and focused to the exhibit that you have just created. Because as you work through that exhibit, your ideas might change, they might evolve. And so you need to go back to that title page and make sure that any changes that are necessary are made. Another really basic thing, and this is something even at national shows here where it's really a very easy thing to do. Many exhibitors do not submit a copy of their title page with the application form. This is only to help you. The sooner the judges get at least a preliminary title page, the sooner they can start researching the subject, they can start doing their preparation. The title page helps the judges evaluate your exhibit. So I can't emphasize enough that preparing that title page ahead of time, getting it into the judge's hands as soon as possible, is really only to benefit you, the exhibitor. Next. Now, just a couple of references that really kind of go into a lot more detail about some of the things I've talked about. And that is, first of all, the APS Manual of Judging and Exhibiting. Although it's predominantly focused on judging, judging and exhibiting are really the left and right hand. They're basically two sides of the same coin. One of the other things which the AAPE, the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors, have on their website are examples of award-winning title pages. And that's a very helpful place to go for some ideas about how you might want to organize and structure your title page. Going back to the title, I really believe that there is nothing more that one can say than what Bill Bauer said back in 1989. He summarized it very, very well. And if one thing you're going to take away from this evening, take away what Bill Bauer said. His words were well said. They express very clearly what a title should be. The title page, I think you'll find these two references helpful. Obviously, I think there'll be some way that you can either take down the details or they'll be available with the YouTube. Now that really draws to a close what I had to say. Last time it took about an hour. I guess this has taken about an hour also. I want to thank Henry and the other gentleman who prepared the slides into Spanish, which I hope were a lot more helpful to you than the English version would have been. And now I don't know if you normally have time for questions or discussion or how we should handle that, Henry.
Yeah, we typically do, but first, Colin, thank you for this presentation. It's been very, very informative to all of us. So at this point, as we typically do, if you guys have any questions, si tienen alguna pregunta en inglés o en español, se la podemos pasar a Colin. I don't see anyone so far yet, but I do have a question related to the title and something you said and something I don't follow. So I have to admit that I probably breaking that rule. I have a one-frame exhibit, that the name is the first coil stamp of the world. He has done
The
really,
first
really
coil
well.
stamp.
That's right.
Okay.
First coil. He has
Right.
done really well, but I always had the same comment. I have to change the title. I have to say that this is the Juan Dinero of 1862 from Peru. But I dare to call it that way because it truly is the first coil stamp. But again,
Okay,
never,
Henry,
yes.
the answer is really simple. You actually have a title and a subtitle. And whether you choose to call it the world's first coil first, and then on the next line or separated by a colon, you say the so-and-so issue, blah, 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 and you give the details. It's that simple. You just put together what they want and what you want, and there you have a clear title. And it emphasizes, it retains your, in a sense, passion that this is the world's first coil stamp, which is the message that you're trying to convey with the clarity of detail that everybody is telling you that you need. You just put the two together and you have the answer.
What I ended up doing is...
You might not like that answer, but that's the answer.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with that. What I ended up doing, just because I wanted to be, you know, I wanted to follow what I want to say, was the title remains the first coil stamp, and the description is where I add the other part. But your point is right. English gives you that flexibility that you can basically concatenate the two and make it more descriptive altogether.
Right.
Thank you.
That was easy. That was easy. That was easy.
Okay, that was good. That was good. It was easy. ¿Alguna otra pregunta por ahí? Any other questions or comments for Colin? Mauricio.
Okay, first, Colin, thanks for the presentation. Regarding what you said about the titles and going a little bit further, instead of just keeping the title maybe in a different language, especially for us, most of us here are Spanish-speaking people, and having the title in English, I do understand your point. But what if, what would you recommend regarding the title page? Would you recommend it also in English and having the rest of the exhibit in Spanish? That's one. And the other question that I have is, for example, when you mentioned the dates on a title, that you said don't go from your earliest piece, starting from your earliest piece shown. But what would be the case if, for example, I put another date, which is not my earliest piece, but the date that I'm starting is maybe the beginning of the issue? That by default will be, this is telling whoever is seeing that you are missing some years or some period, as I understood it. If you're not listing maybe your earliest piece, because you want to begin from that date for any given reason. But if you don't begin with that date, maybe it could occur that you're showing that you're missing something. Do you agree, or we can comment about that? Okay, well, let's split my response into two parts. The first is on the title page. If it is for a national exhibition or a regional exhibition, where, for example, if it was a FIAF exhibition where almost the entire jury is Spanish speaking, I think the title page in Spanish is not really an issue. It's really, it becomes, doing it in Spanish, it's not an issue. For a world exhibition where you have juries from Europe, from North America, from South America, from Australia, from Asia, I think, generally speaking, you will benefit from having at least the title page in English. And that simply comes back to the readability and the accessibility for jurors.
and I will admit that even in English, FIP jurors differ in their comfort level with English, but it is more likely that they will at least be able to follow a title page in English, whereas a title page in Spanish, I mean, they might try using Google Translate or something, but an English title page is likely to be more accessible to them. And at the end of the day, you want the jury on your side. And as much as you can make their job easier, that's going to help you. So that's the first point. The second point, it relates to the dating of your earliest item and the scope of the exhibit. There are kind of two related problems here. And I'll try and give a couple of examples. Say you were showing an exhibit of pre-stamped covers of the United States. And your earliest items were from the 1700s. And you said, actually, no, let me back up. Let me change the example slightly. Say your earliest items were from the 1780s, 1790s, and the early 1800s. So that is to say, after the American independence. And say your title of your exhibit was U.S. pre-stamp postal history. And all your items start post-U.S. independence. The obvious question is, well, where is your postal history prior to the American War of Independence? So obviously you would then backtrack and say, well, my title should be something along the lines of U.S. pre-stamp postal history. I mean, it's not going to be the exact thing, but U.S. postal history after the War of Independence.
I see.
Because you've said the exhibit is starting with the independence of the country, which was a major political change, for better or worse. But if you simply leave that pre-stamp prior to 1847 and prior to the Postmaster Provisionals wide open, but you only start very late, you're in a sense, you're creating a weakness in the exhibit. Now, one of the problems that oftentimes happens, say the bulk of your collection of pre-stamp or stampless covers is post 1774. Every item bar 2 items are after 1774. What do you do with those 2 items? They might be really nice items that fall well below before that. What do you do with those 2 items? Well, there are 2 things you can do. One is you can leave them out, but they may be 2 of your most cherished and most items, in which you play with the heading for the page and you call forerunners under the British administration. That way, the scope of your exhibit remains starting with the War of Independence, but you have 2 forerunners from the prior British administration. So there are ways in which you can massage that beginning period. The other thing at the end is if, for example, you had, take a specific example, say you had an exhibit of Palestine pictorial issues. The Palestine pictorial issues started in the late 20s and went through to the beginning, close to the beginning of the foundation of the State of Israel. Now, if everything you show is prior to the Second World War, you don't want a time period for the pictorials that's 1927 to 1948. Mm-hmm. You would adjust your title to the beginning of the Second World War, and you would then on your title page explain why you stopped the exhibit at the beginning of the Second World War. So as an exhibitor, you have a little bit of latitude to justify your position, to justify what you're doing. But your argument should be convincing and logical. Does that answer your question in a kind of roundabout, long-winded way?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have two more questions. We will go first with Jaime, and then we go with Manuel. Jaime.
Okay.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Colin, for a wonderful lecture tonight. My question is regarding the inclusion of a map, a geographical map in the title page, because in my exhibits, it's necessary when you talk about routes to basically show in geographical terms those routes and where they started, where they ended. But the problem is with, in my case at least, that this map is usually very complex, so it tends to be very large. And the smallest I can get it is to fit a third of the page, and that really hurts the amount of space that I have left to put all the other information. Would you recommend that that map should be repeated when it becomes necessary to show a route, and don't put the map in the title page, or to just, because it is important when you talk about routes, and to show it and make cuts by bibliography or other stuff that should be there?
Okay, I mean, obviously I'm speaking in the general, and this may not necessarily directly relate to your exhibit, but I would say the following. A map that takes up the vast majority or a big part of your title page is not helpful. It's not helpful. What probably would be more helpful is, depending how your routes are arranged within the exhibit, at the beginning of, say, Route A, assuming you have multiple pages relating to Route A, you have a subsection that explains Route A and shows the map covering the detail of Route A. The beginning of Route B, you have a map that simply extracts the data for Route B, and so on through each of the relevant postal routes, rather than trying to consolidate all that onto one map at the beginning of the exhibit. And you can say on the title page that each section, each postal route is prefaced with a map showing the relevant geographic details of that route. Then you said it. Actually showing one overview map of, or unless there is some key message that overall map conveys that's really, really important. Is it not that each of those routes, the details of each of those routes, is more important insofar as it relates to that route than how those routes necessarily interact? Or is the interaction of those routes a fundamental part of the story you're trying to tell?
Well, it is important, but I like the way you are suggesting about how to handle the complexity of I mean, because I'm talking about basically small Mexican towns that nobody outside of Mexico would know where they are.
Right.
So it's vital to comprehend the route that is being shown, to put a map and basically showing from where to where it was run. So I will give it a thought and maybe implement that suggestion you are giving me tonight. Thank you very much, Colin.
One further thought, and this is one of the problems with postal history is that you have so many things going on all at the same time with covers and routes and rates, so many things all happening at the same moment, as it were. And one of the, in a sense, guiding things is, in English, we say, dumb the story down. An exhibit is not a definitive hardbound book. An exhibit is like, there used to be a magazine, Picture Post, which was pictures with captions and whatever. And an exhibit is like a magazine. It's full of pictures with captions. And you know what? It's sometimes you have to lose some of the detail of the story to get the message across, to make it readable, to make it understandable. And that's why I in a sense, I'm repeating myself, coming back to the idea of splitting out those routes and splitting out the narrative about those routes and the detail of those routes and making it route by route by route. And I think it will just make it more readable. But also think about, and I'm not saying when I say dumb the story down, be any less truthful about the story, but sometimes you don't always need all of the detail. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. Okay.
Sometimes the story can come across much better in a more summaried form. And that I think is one of the issues that you may be grappling with. You talk about all these small towns that nobody's heard of and whatever. Mm-hmm. Think about how you can just, in a sense, let some of the detail fall away, but still convey the information and convey the history and the facts.
Yes.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you very much, Colin.
Okay. Now there was one more question.
Yeah, there was one more question. Manuel.
Yeah, Colin, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. I do have a question. It's related to include in the first page stamps or an item related to the exhibit. Basically, I'm collecting revenues, especially from Colombia. And I do have one stamp, which is for me very important and very rare. And I decided to include it in the first page. Is that appropriate or should be eliminated?
Well, again, there is not necessarily a single answer, okay? If the item...
But before you continue, could I share this first page to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about?
Sure,
yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, I see it. I see it. Okay. All right. This, if this stamp was shown within your exhibit, within the body of the exhibit.
Yes, it is.
Would it, let me ask you some specific questions. Would it be on a single page because there's nothing else you could put on that page with it?
No, there is more material to be included. Actually, there are 2 pieces more out of the 5 recorded, but
Okay.
in the documents.
So I would say that it would be better to include it within the storyline of the exhibit with that other material. Putting it on the title page, I mean, if you're going to include a piece on the title page, if there is something, say there is an item that you have that really does not fit comfortably within the exhibit, and really you're left scratching your head wondering, where am I going to put this item? Sometimes putting it on the title page can solve that problem. Because simply you have nowhere else to put it. I mean, there's an exhibit of Bermuda, the Queen Victoria issues of Bermuda. And the exhibitor had 3 essays, which he really struggled with where to put them in the exhibit. And Santiago Cruz said, why not consider putting them on the title page? And these 3 hand-painted essays, he was able to logically include on the title page easily. Within the body of the exhibit, he really was struggling where to put them. That is an example where it worked. It made sense to put those items that really did not have a home elsewhere in the exhibit on the title page. Going back to what I just said about, say you had those 2 early US items of postal history from, say, the late 1600s that didn't really fit within the exhibit. That is something, if you wanted to include one, you might slip it onto the title page. But I think one has to think long and hard before you put an item on the title page, because you're using up space that you can explain about your exhibit. And almost invariably, and there's always an exception, almost invariably, the items are better placed within the logical sequence in the exhibit. To take a really important item, pull it out of the story, and stick it on the title page, there has to be a really, really good reason to do that.
Okay. Excellent. I understand very well.
If literally this was the only thing and you had nothing else to put with it, and it would be stuck there like an orphan on a page all by itself in the middle of your story, and it didn't really fit with the prior page and the following page, then okay, put it on the title page. But if it fits logically within the story, with the other material, it fills up a page, leave it where it belongs in the story.
Okay, I agree with you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other question around? I don't see anyone, but
I have a question. Yep.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Yes, Colin, how are you doing? Thank you for your conference. Excellent.
Thank you for your message earlier in the day.
Yeah, thank you. Let me show you my first page from the exhibit I have in the traditional. I have a quick question here. Okay, this is my first page, and what do you think about put the name on the first page, the name of the exhibitor? In some exhibitors, in some exhibitions, I saw the name on here I put on the right side and the corner. What do you think about that? And what do you think about put some information about the improvement of the exhibition? In this case, I was putting some information about Korea. I don't think it's correct that in this page put the pedigree of the historical background, the medals, or how improved this collection in actually from the other VIP exhibition. I was putting this, but I am thinking about that. What do you think about it?
Okay, all right. Let's deal with the use of the name first. The name should not be on the title page. what you've done is what you've done above that, where you say exhibitors, articles, catalogs, and monographs, I think it is. That's a subtle way of saying who the exhibitor is. If you want to actually have your name attached to it, you're mentioning basically the author's articles. If the judge looks up the articles, they're going to know whose exhibit it is. It's more discreet not to put the name. It's more appropriate not to put the name. First of all, the kind of the historical evolution of the exhibit, how, in a sense, the new items that have been added, the prior track record of when the exhibit was shown, the medals that it received, and so on. That should all go on the synopsis. It should not be on the title page. All of that information goes with the synopsis. That the exhibit application will ask you about prior exhibitions and prior medals and whatever. Obviously, you include that, and that will go to the jury secretary and to the organizing committee. But again, that should all be should not be on the title page.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Colin.
Okay, you're welcome.
Let's see anyone else. Colin, I have a final question.
Okay.
The title page, what we learned today is it basically charting the course of creating the framework of the rest of the exhibit. But if you look into everything else from the else of the exhibit, especially in postal history, if it is a development type of postal history exhibit, what works best from, let's say, the perception of the judges? If it is all chronologically independent of the type of items that may be in it, or if you create chapters like this is for registered mail, this is domestic mail, this is, you know, international mail, this is, I don't know, third-party mail, whatever. So in a way that goes start and stop with the periods, but it basically frames it within the chapter. What do you think is the best approach?
Okay, in my mind, the worst organization for a postal history exhibit is straight chronological from the beginning, from page 2 to the end. Chronological. That is the worst possible arrangement. Because basically, if it is arranged in date order, you're going to jump from domestic mail, overseas mail, registered mail, ordinary mail, official mail, regular mail. You're going to jump around, and there's going to be no cohesion, no logic to the way the material is arranged. It's just going to be kind of like random outbursts arranged chronologically. There's going to be no pattern to it. The key thing is to say how it comes back to the rates, the routes, and the markings. How was the postal service? How did the postal service develop? What was the structure of the postal service? You had a domestic service, you had a foreign service, you had a local post office, you had foreign post offices operating. Look at your, whatever country it is, look at, in a sense, how the system operated. What were the key components of that system? And that is how it should be arranged. Now, within each section of service or marking or whatever, there may be a chronological flow. But for example, I mean, say you're doing postal markings. Markings invariably overlap. So if you arrange the stuff chronologically, say you've got box markings and you've got circular markings and you've got town markings, and if everything is arranged chronological, there is absolutely no, you can't, it is almost impossible to wrap your mind around what the exhibit is about. And really, it goes back to readability. Many of those topics that I highlighted for the title page, you know, brevity, relevance, objectivity, readability, they apply to each of the sections and to each of the pages through the exhibit as well. You know, if you're going to call it unique, make really sure that it is unique. Don't exaggerate. If there are 6 known, don't say there are only 2 known. I mean, all of those principles apply all the way through. But the most important thing, and this is this very well used word, treatment. Treatment. How is the stuff? How is the stuff? Think of on your desk, you've got 10 little boxes and you're throwing your covers into those boxes. How do you group those covers in those 10 boxes? What goes in which box? Well, you put the domestic ones together and you put the ones to overseas destinations together. But actually, overseas to Europe is different to overseas to other countries. Well, okay, so now that's another little box. Think about the boxes in which you group your material. Now, as you group your material, ideally, you don't want a whole bunch of sections that just comprise one single page.
Mm-hmm.
So think about, okay, you want sections that are roughly equal in size. I'm not saying they need to correspond to a frame or a half frame, but you know, you need to have enough to make a worthwhile section. If you're going to have one cover to a foreign destination, that's certainly not worth a whole section. You know, find a way to slip it into another section. I mean, in a sense, the evolution of the postal service in each country follows certain basic similarities.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there are some unique features, but in most cases, they develop in a very similar way. Expansion of offices, increased number of offices, new post offices open, new routes open up, additional services are added, whether it's registration or express or airmail. All these services are added to an existing simple system. Then you can say, well, now am I going to include telegraphs? How do you want to handle things like telegraphy? Is that relevant? Do you want to include it? Do you want to exclude it? You know, you can see how the posts and telegraphs interacted if you wish to pursue that. But I mean, generally, in each case, the volume of mail increases. The diversity of destinations increases over time. I mean, if you take the 1847 issue of the US, for example, the foreign destinations are few and far between. You know, there's one to South America, there's a bunch to Britain, there's a bunch to France, a couple to Holland. But, you know, there's nothing to Asia. There's one to Egypt. I mean, you can't, there's very little you can do in terms of developing mail service overseas. That only happens in the 51-57 period. And from the 61 onwards, it happens even more. There's even more destinations. So, you know, depending on your time period, your boxes are going to differ a little bit. But think of it as a series of file boxes on your desk, and which box do you throw the covers in to make coherent sections that are meaningful, that are internally consistent and meaningful within themselves. That's what you're aiming for.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I always took the opposite route and make it chronological, but just the relevant events to highlight that particular section. But I got your point, because I have seen it both ways. With enough material, there is enough to create different chapters.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a very limited amount of material and each of the boxes is very small, then, you know, maybe by default, maybe by accident, chronological is the only way to go. But almost invariably, with most countries, you've got so many stories happening at once that you don't want to keep jumping around. You want to make it logical and readable. And so you pick off part by part by part.
Yep.
And as I say, that to every rule, there's an exception. And if you have a country with so little postal history that, you know, you struggle to fill two frames, you have no choice.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, but then, you know, you pick your country, and so you pick your own cross to bear. You know.
right? Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else over there? Any other question? ¿Alguna otra pregunta, comentario? Bueno, Colin, it has been a pleasure and very, very informative presentation. So we thank you very much for it.
Very, very nice.
You're welcome. As you all probably realize, I have my opinions.
That's perfectly okay, because you are now here in a wonderful group of Latin American opinionated philatelists, so everything is fantastic. All right.
But I think the Middle Eastern philatelists are also opinionated. The American philatelists are also opinionated. I think it's a common trait.
That's right. It's a commonality in philately, right? We always have to have a position some way, somehow.
Yeah, that's true. But listen, one final thought. If anybody has any questions and they want to email me, Henry, I don't know if there's some way you can at least let everybody have my email if they want to email me. And the thing I would say is that they can email me in Spanish, because my wife, as some of you know, speaks Spanish quite well. And so she can always translate for me.
Fantastic. What I will do is I will include your email in the presentation, because in the videos, we always attach a PDF of the presentation. So we will have both versions, English and Spanish, and I will add your email on it.
Okay, perfect.
All righty. Y el día de mañana.